Hey everybody, this is Bradley here. I'd like to do a quick video here on demonstrating the paints that I use. A lot of times people ask questions, which paints do I use, which paints do I prefer, and how we mix and match them and how we get them to all work for what we're wanting to paint. So there's a lot of different paints that I've got here in front of us. The first two that are pretty most important and the ones that I use the most of is your Createx paint, which you can find at local Hobby Lobby or a lot of your craft and art supply stores. They carry these in a 2-ounce bottle, sometimes 4-ounce bottles, and even bigger in some places. The other ones that I use an awful lot of also is the Proline paints. Same type of deal. They're water-based, usually come in the 2-ounce bottles in a variety of colors. So the other 4 paints here we'll talk about in just a minute, but we can use those as well. A couple reasons why I like using both of these types of paints, either the Proline or the Createx, is they're titled airbrush paints. A lot of basically your airbrush will handle any type of these paints without having to thin them down and reduce them. A lot of people ask, hey, how much do you thin them down? Which ones do you thin down? Which ones do you don't? Believe it or not, I don't have to thin down either one of them that much at all. In fact, a lot of times you can shoot these right straight through the airbrush. You'll see as you start to paint, some of the paints will be a little bit thicker than other paints. So those, in order to get them to spray exactly how you want, you may have to use a reducer to reduce them down. And I'll show you how to do that here shortly also. So for the most part, both of these paints are pre-mixed and ready to go. Make sure you shake them good and you should have no issues with them. The other paints that I've tried is some of the other off brands that are out there. They're not titled for RC car bodies or RC paint. In fact, they're not even titled airbrush paint. So with doing a lot of extensive testing and trial and error with these bodies, I found that these types of paints will also work. They look very similar to your normal 2-ounce bottles that you get from either Createx or Proline. But the reason why these will work, and I found that these will work, is you got to look for the multi-surface. You can see on a lot of these bottles, when you get them, they'll be titled multi-surface. I wouldn't be as hung up on looking for the enamel or the acrylic or the different types of paint that it is, but if it has to be a multi-surface is what you want to look for. These things, looking at them and testing them, they'll work on glass, they'll work on ceramic, they'll work on poster board, they'll work on pretty much everything that's out there. And a lot of these are even waterproof. So look for the multi-surface. Most all of them will be titled that to where you can use them for the type of product that we're doing. These do work. I've had great success with them, and they do stick to the Lexan fairly well. The only thing you have to keep in mind, and maybe it's a little bit too much for you now, but these paints are not made for airbrush, which basically means that these paints, you want to put them on with a paintbrush. So as you can tell, a lot of this paint is thicker than normal. Don't try to put this through your airbrush because it will not shoot through it. It will plug it up, and it's very, very thick. So what you have to do is, in order to get them to work, is you have to use the reducers to thin the paint down to get them through the airbrush that you want. I tried a lot of different paints. These here particular paints do work because when you thin them down, what you want to look for is you don't want to have the paint get too watery or run down, and you also don't want to change the properties of the paint. Meaning a lot of times people say, well, do you use water to thin them down, or what do you thin them down with? The reducers that I'll show you will work with them, and you'll notice when you're reducing these down, these paints will stay to the same consistency that like your Createx and your Proline paints will. They won't get really thinned down or watered down to where you spray them, you don't get the coverage, and you don't have any adhesion issues with it. So I'll show some other videos down the road where we try to mix and spray some of these other off-brand paints to get them to work, but you will need to reduce those down in order to get them to work and go through your air gun. A lot of times these other paints, why we tried them, is there's some different off colors, some different unique colors that you can get with these that your normal brands don't offer. They do offer a lot of variety, but some people may want to have a different type of gold or a certain particular blues that they can use with it. So we'll get more into some other videos down the road of when we actually sit down and reduce some of these, and I'll show you how they'll thin out and they'll spray, but you have to get them to act and feel the same way as the other Proline and the Createx paint shoot. So the brands that I had chosen that worked really good was the Folk Art. You can get these at Hobby Lobby. They're actually quite a bit cheaper too. I think some of these, you can get them on sale. They have like, buy 4, get 1 free, or they're even like $2.50 or $3 a piece. They're really inexpensive. But the Folk Art I use quite a bit of. This another brand named Craftsman, ironically. Also, and then the Deco Art. But all three of those brands work really well. Keep in mind you have to use the multi-surface and you will have to reduce those down. So the Createx and the Proline paints, just make sure that you shake them well. You won't have any problems with coverage or any of the pearl issues spraying. Just shake them well and make sure you shake them all the time. If you don't use a particular color, what I do is I'll go down every now and then as I'm airbrushing, I'll see a color that I don't use. I'll take the bottle out and shake it to just make sure that you keep it all mixed up. There are a lot of other brands of paints that are out there. Spastic is another paint that's out there. There's Duratrax makes them. The Tamiya makes a spray can. There's all different types of paints that you can use. The only word of caution that I use is when you use those paints together, every one of them is going to act different with each other and act different when you spray them together. For example, if you spray Proline paint over a Spastic paint or a Tamiya paint or a Testors or whatever you're going to use, those paints all act different. So I like using these paints. I tell people all the time and urge them, if you're going to use a water-based paint, stick with using the water-based paints. They're going to interact with each other. They're not going to have the tendency to bleed. You're not going to have any coverage issues when you start, like you would if you were to start mixing other paints that are not compatible. So if you have good luck and you find paints that you like spraying over the top of each other and they work, by all means, do it if it works for you. One thing that I'm recommending is, because I've had great success with using all of these paints together, interact fine with each other. So if you start having trouble when you start introducing the other paints, a lot of times you're going to have issues of the paints not being compatible with one another. Each one of the paints are going to have different dyes to them, different pigments. They all act different with each other. So if you're having issues with that, just take a step back and look to make sure that you're not mixing colors that aren't gonna, do well and get the coverage that you want. A couple other things that you can do while I use a lot of these paints, a lot of the colors that, as airbrushing, you're gonna use a lot of, is I use a lot of the bigger bottles of the black and the white. I typically back all of my bodies in a black. I like that for two reasons. For one, photo purposes. A lot of times there's a lot of pictures taken of the bodies that are out there, whether it be for magazines or box art or even on the track for different manufacturers for a new product that's coming out. But it also makes the car look unique and like a real car. I think one thing that kills me is you get a great paint job on a body and all of a sudden you look at a shot and the A pillar or the B pillar or somewhere in the car you can see through it and there's white paint or something. So I like to have it to where the car looks pretty much realistic. The other thing too is if you're running nitro and you get any type of oil or fuel that may build up on the inside of the body, the black's going to help block that quite a bit and protect it as well. So as far as the bottles, these are the 8-ounce bottles that I get. You can get them at Hobby Lobbies where I typically get mine. They're right around $15 a bottle. You can get bigger bottles, and I've done that in the past. The only thing that I don't do is I don't get the bigger bottles in the 8-ounce, reason being is I want fresh paint all the time. I shoot a lot of paint, but I still find it best if an 8-ounce bottle is going to last you quite a bit. When you're painting, it's not going to last you months. You may get like a week out of it or maybe a week and a half out of it, but by then I'm always out making some run around, or I pick up a fresh bottle as I go. So sometimes the bigger bottles that you get, if it takes a while to go through them, as you get through the bottom of the bottle, you're going to find out that the paint's going to start to get a little bit thicker and start to get a little older on you. So I don't mind making a trip to the store every week or so to pick up another bottle to keep that fresh paint in stock all the time. So black and white is typically the only colors that I buy in the bigger bottles. I can get some of the 4-ounce if I find colors that I use a lot in the Createx that I go through. So let's move on now to reducing the paint. A lot of times there's a whole lot of different variables out there and suggestions on people as to what they use to reduce their paint. I've heard of everything from I use water because it's a water-based paint to thin it down. I use Windex. They have all types of creations of Windex and rubbing alcohol and every type of product that's out there to reduce the paint. I don't do that. They make reducers for these paints for a reason, and it's to reduce the paint down. When you start introducing the other product like the Windex or whatever type of material product you're using, you're going to change the whole properties of the paint. It's going to start to water down. It's going to thin it down. And they don't react as well. And you're probably going to end up with some adhesion issues on that. So if you're using something other than what I recommend, that's totally fine. If it's working for you and it's sticking, by all means do it. My theory is there's a reason why the product is made for your paint as a reducer, is to reduce the paint. So buy it and use it. It's not that expensive. You're not going to spend a whole lot of money on it. A couple of the reducers that I use, and these are only two that I use, is I'll use the Createx, and this is the 4011. There's a couple different brands of 4012, 4013. There's a couple different ones, but I use the 4011 reducer. It's very simple. This bottle I buy in the 8-ounce bottle. It's probably a quarter gone, and it's lasted me about 5 months. So that shows you how very little I thin down the paints when I use them. The other one I've also used too is a sample, some bottles that I've got, is the Proline, and it works very, very similar to the 4011 reducer. If you can't get the 4011 or you just want to get the smaller bottles, you don't need that big a bottle, by all means, the Proline, the paint reducer, works fine. You can use the Proline reducer on any of the Createx or any of the Proline paints. The other paints that I mentioned earlier, the multi-surface, these two bottles, this product is what I use to thin these down, okay? Each one is going to need to be thinned down quite a bit different than what you're going to need to use for the Proline or the Createx. Don't worry about that now. I'll do a whole other video on how to reduce these paints down. But basically, if you get either one of these thinners or both of these thinners, they're going to be able to reduce down any one of the paints that I use. So like I mentioned, you don't have to use a whole lot of thinner when you're reducing these paints down. And I'll show you how to reduce those as well. When I'm down in the booth and reducing the paints out, one thing that I use is a little simple eyedropper bottle. It comes, you can get them in hobby stores. It comes also with some of the airbrushes. But I'll fill this bottle up, and it's probably, I'm guessing, about a 1-ounce bottle, maybe a 3/4 ounce bottle. This will last me a month easily just by filling this up. So I don't even need to use the whole big bottle to pour it out of. You can use it as an eyedropper. So when you open it up, when you apply it in your cup, you're going to use merely 4 to 6 drops. We'll show you how to reduce that in other videos, but just trying to stress the, the point that I don't use a whole lot of thinner when reducing these paints down. So a couple other things that I do as far as the paints that I use, I'll use all the different varieties of the Proline. They make, your regular metallic paints that you can get. They make all the fluorescent colors, and they also make a lot of your basic colors that are out there. They also do have a candy line, which works really well. Also, you'll want to back those with golds or silvers or pearls or, even a chrome if you do use that. So another product that I'll talk about a little bit later in a whole other video that I use quite a bit, and actually more than paint, is actually a clear paint. And people say, why are you using clear? There's a lot of different purposes and a lot of different reasons for using this clear. I'll demonstrate that in some other videos. And what it'll do is it'll give you a whole different array of ways to make the overspray, the shadowing effect. It's also going to help you too if you're layering paints in areas where you don't want to get into some static issues where you're limited on the types of paints that you can use and the overspray effect that you're going to do. So clear is what I use an awful lot of, and like I said, we'll show you that and introduce that to you in another video. One last thing that I'd like to talk about, a lot of times people say, well, what order do you paint in? And the rule of thumb back in the days when we was using more of the lacquers and the acrylics and the enamels and what have you, is you always want to paint your darker colors first. Okay, that is not the case with the water-based paints. If you paint these correctly and you layer them and you spray them and you back them correctly, you can paint any color at any time that you need to. My rule of thumb when I paint is I always paint the thinnest lines first. Okay, so if you have a thin line and it needs to be white, go ahead and paint it white. I'll show you in some other videos how you can do that and not have to worry about paints bleeding through and the colors if you stick with the water-based paints that I use.